If you had to guess, is suicide among men in the United States increasing or decreasing? Increasing, obviously. I wouldn't make this video otherwise. So let's talk a bit about male suicide and what the cause might or might not be for the rising trend. The American Society for Suicide Prevention has some disturbing statistics to start us off. Almost 50,000 Americans die by suicide each year. Men are 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide compared to women, and 70% of suicides are white men. Every year, this trend, which is mostly and disproportionately killing men, this trend is gradually increasing. This graph shows a slow but steady increase over the last decade from 11.3 suicides per 100,000 people per year in 2007 to 13.4 in 2016. That's an increase of 18% over the last decade. An article in the New York Times reads, quote, "From 1999 to 2010, the suicide rate among Americans ages 35 to 64 rose by nearly 30%, end quote. Later, the Times calls out that, quote, "The most pronounced increases were seen among men in their 50s, a group in which suicide rates jumped by nearly 50%, end quote. Suicide is becoming more common in recent years, and it's mostly becoming more common with men. This increase is affecting older men dramatically. Let's keep these facts in mind as we start to consider possible causes. The information I just showed was specific to the United States, but the trend extends outside of the United States as well. Here are some excerpts from UC Lancaster students reacting to the statistic that suicide is the single most common cause of death for men ages 20 to 49 in England and Wales.
And they don't want to talk to people because they feel that that's a problem in itself, isn't it? I'm a man, I don't want to talk about my
It's a stigma that gets attached to them as well, the thing that gets attached to them.
Yeah.
Ridiculous, like it's this high. It just proves that there's stigma with men not talking about how they actually feel.
Really doesn't surprise me. Because again, we talked about men being told to man up, and so when they have problems or feelings that society doesn't deem appropriate, they don't talk about these feelings. They push them, try and push them down.
Like as men or as boys and males in society, like you're not really allowed to speak out about just like feeling sad, or like you kind of feel like a bit of a wimp if you go out and tell people, oh, I've been feeling sad for no particular reason. Like
with it being a taboo subject anyway, it's even more difficult to talk about when it's men, because they're expected to be like stereotypically tough and like macho and man up. Like, we use that phrase too much.
You may have noticed that several of the students already have an explanation in mind, that men are killing themselves because they can't talk about their feelings, because of the expectations that society has for men to be strong and stoic. The fact that the students all jump to these conclusions, that social problems are about sexism and gender norms, is revealing as to how kids are being educated. Jane Powell launched and led a program called CALM to help prevent suicide in boys in the United Kingdom. Here she is giving her credentials.
In the late 1990s, I was asked to launch a pilot aimed at young men and to try and get them to access a helpline and to use music and culture to get them to do so. And I couldn't think really at the time of anything that I was less qualified to do. I had no interest and still don't really, I must confess, in men or culture or music or sports. I have a lifelong interest in politics, feminism. And might as well say now, no qualifications whatsoever in mental health.
Oh, what's that? Suicide's the #1 killer of young men in the UK? Well, I guess we better get someone with no qualifications on that. I don't mean to disparage Powell. She seems like a genuine and caring person doing good work. I just think, from her description, she seems like a strange choice to head this organization. But that's beside the point. Let's see what she has to say about possible reasons for men committing suicide.
There is a real embarrassment about talking about the needs of men and boys, because we shouldn't and we can't, because they are obviously, they are the measurement by which everything else exists. We can't talk about them being vulnerable, because actually the definition of a guy is that he is invulnerable, and so therefore if he's needing in any way at all, then he's not a real man. It is comic the extent to which we ignore and fail to talk about this particular issue. But the reason that we don't talk about this issue is because we have a sexism which is almost invisible, that it's everywhere, it's invasive, it invades, and yet our screens and our papers and our day-to-day language are filled with sexism against guys, and we don't blink. So grow a pair, be a man. That's all fine. All the stuff, all those pictures which are sent at guys about how they should be are about them being strong and tough and obviously able to do the DIY, to hit things very hard and to be above all strong.
Now, these clips don't capture all of what Powell has to say. There's a lot I left out and a lot that I actually agree with, and I think that is smart and useful that she's saying. However, the clips that I've shown highlight a central theme or premise of her idea about what's driving the male suicide epidemic, which is she thinks it's sexism. She thinks, like those university students we just saw, that men are expected to be stoic and strong, and so they can't get help. And so because they're depressed and can't get help, they wind up killing themselves. Australia is seeing the same problem. Men are disproportionately committing suicide. And some Australians seem to have the same idea as Powell and those students as to the cause of the male trend in suicides.
There's definitely a crisis, and men have got to talk about it. You know, girls will always tell their girlfriends what's going on. They're more willing to talk about it. They understand feelings and emotions and can talk about that. When men call Lifeline, they struggle with the emotions. They struggle with talking about their feelings.
There's no ideal person. There's no, oh, this is the way we should be. It's just an idea that people have. It's just a stereotype that people have of what it is to be a man. It's got nothing to do with being a man. It takes more of a man to admit that they're feeling something.
Why are 3 times more men committing suicide than women? Up until the age of 8 or 9, boys, they cry the same amount as girls, and then they get taught to stop. Like, they're not allowed anymore, and it's ridiculous.
In other words, the gender-focused kind of academic perspective that the students have all been taught, and that Powell's expressing and that we saw from Australia, is that sexism is causing everything. When men commit more suicide than women, that's sexism too. The data doesn't support that idea though. Here we see a graph from the CDC, which shows suicide rates over time for men divided by race. Suicide is up for whites and Native Americans. Suicide is flat for Hispanics and down for blacks. Why, if this is a gender thing, is it different by race, and why is it getting worse over time? Is it really plausible that white men are so bound by the stereotype of men being stoic and strong that they won't seek counseling, whereas Hispanics and blacks don't have that same burden or that same stereotype imposed on them? Hispanic men aren't expected to be stoic, or white men in the 90s had less of an expectation to be stoic? We saw earlier that the rising trend in suicides is affecting older men the most. Do men make it to age 50 before sexist ideas about masculinity catch up to and kill them? We can see a similar kind of trend in female suicide. Most of the increase in the recent years is in suicides for white women and female Native Americans. So if suicide is increasing among white women, is this because white women or Native American women are taught that they have to be strong and stoic, more so than women of other races? So maybe something else is going on. The fact that it's different by race suggests to me that this is not a gender-based issue. The fact that blacks and Hispanics have low and not increasing rates of suicide tells me that it's probably not our ideas about masculinity that are causing the suicide epidemic. It's difficult to determine what masculine expectations there are for each race. However, I took a quick look and found this press release from the Columbia Business School, which reviews 3 studies that looked at masculinity by race. And these studies looked at information from census data, they looked at sports teams, and they looked at survey results. And what they found was consistent across all 3 studies. Their consistent finding was that black people are typically viewed as more masculine than white people, who are in turn more masculine than Asian people. So this is problematic for the idea that it's thoughts about masculinity that are responsible for the male suicide epidemic, because society views black men as more masculine than white men. And so if masculinity causes suicide, or if masculinity causes people to be unwilling to get help for their depression, then why is it that black people aren't the most affected by suicide? In reality, black people have a very low rate of suicide compared to whites, and it's not increasing over time. The theory that male suicides are driven by sexism really just doesn't make sense given this basic look at the data. The thoughts that preceded this moment are all based on information from reliable sources and direct reasoning from that information. Now I'd like to throw out a more theoretical idea about the cause of male suicide. I'll attempt to back it up with what evidence I have available, but I want to call out that what is about to be said is less well supported by evidence than what I've just said. Here's Jordan Peterson to describe an idea that I think might relate to suicide.
I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody what are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility, because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion, and we're only having half that discussion. And the question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? You know, you're completely out. You have no idea what it's almost impossible to describe how bad an idea that is. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. Then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look, you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up.
What if an increase in suicide is coming from a lack of burden or purpose to our lives? Perhaps modern society has made things too easy for people, or conditioned people, as Peterson would say, to expect rights from the government rather than to expect to bear responsibilities. So youth unemployment is up across the Western world. People are getting married later in life. People are having fewer children. These are all things that could be burdens or responsibilities to bear and give meaning to life. And they're being put off or abandoned increasingly. So perhaps it's this kind of deficit of burdens made worse by our modern society, which is putting people in unnatural circumstances instead of working a job out in the fields or with your hands or exploring or hunting like our ancestors did. You're sitting in an office or tapping on a keyboard. You're being an attendant at a store. You're doing things that humans weren't built to do, haven't evolved to do. And doing something so unnatural is generating a kind of ennui, a restless, purposeless depression that's afflicting people by robbing them of a burden that could give their life purpose. On the one hand, this might explain why white people have higher suicide rates than blacks or Hispanics. Perhaps blacks and Hispanics have to shoulder the burden that results from facing more racism than white people do. So if the broader society is racist towards a small group of Black and Hispanic people, perhaps the burden of dealing with that, of having to come together with a community, with your community, to identify with your community, and work to overcome the burden imposed upon you by a racist external society, perhaps that burden is providing something for Black and Hispanic people to strive against, to work against, a burden to bear, which may keep their suicide rate low. It doesn't exactly fit because Native American Indians have the highest suicide rates out of any race. I wasn't able to find a statistic on the percentage of Native Americans who receive government assistance. However, the federal government does manage native lands and give unique benefits to American Indians. There's a story from NPR which says, quote, "There's a perception out there that all Navajos are on welfare. American Indians do receive unique benefits from the federal government, like free health care, and high percentages of Navajos receive food stamps and live in public housing. But considering unemployment on the reservation is around 50%, Gorman says the number of Navajos on welfare is surprisingly low." End quote. So what if Native Americans are relatively more likely to live on reservations in areas where they are the racial majority, and therefore they face less racial discrimination? Therefore, they don't have that same burden that I'm imagining that Black and Hispanic people might have to bear. The Navajo from the NPR story lack a purpose. They have high unemployment at 50%. So they aren't finding a purpose through work. They also receive a lot of government services and live on land that's managed by the federal government. So perhaps removing an opportunity, so perhaps the benefits that they receive from the government, combined with their lack of work, combined with the fact that they are the racial majority, perhaps this is removing an opportunity to find a meaningful burden for some of the young people among the Native American tribes. I realize this whole thing, this whole idea is a stretch, yet Jordan Peterson's explanation intuitively appeals to me. Our current culture is softer and easier than ever before thanks to technology. And of course, in most ways, that's a very, very good thing. But in the context of this conversation, perhaps it also has a harmful aspect to it. You are living a life that you didn't evolve for, where your work is not what your body is naturally built for, where burdens may be removed from you by the government providing for you, by welfare, by government assistance of any kind. You're marrying later, you're working less, and all of these things combined mean you have less of a burden, less of an obligation, less of a reason to continue living, and without that reason, a number of men don't continue living. Suicide is a real tragedy, but even greater or beyond the individual tragic loss of life is the idea that so many people in our society are so depressed that the suicide rates are rising. And if so many people are killing themselves, how many more must be living miserable lives? This is an indication that we need to work on something fundamental about our society. And this is one other reason why I object to the interpretation of male suicides that was put forth by people like Jane Powell. The idea that this is all about men not being secure enough in their own masculinity to seek out help from a counselor ignores a more dire possibility, which is that men are reacting to uncomfortable or unpleasant, depressing facts about their own lives. Perhaps you don't need to hear a counselor or a suicide prevention person tell you it will be okay. Perhaps even though you're a man, you don't need to cry in public or expose your feelings. Perhaps you just need real solutions to real problems. Perhaps you can't find a job. Perhaps your wage has been flat for decades. Perhaps you don't have friends, or you can't get married. Perhaps you can't have kids. Perhaps your wife is divorcing you. Perhaps you lost your kids in the divorce. Perhaps you have a real problem. And what we need to be doing is working to structure society in such a way that these problems can be solved, or they won't be that bad, or people can find assistance and answers for their real problems and not just treat the suicidal impulse that may come about as a result. I realize one interpretation of what I've said here may be construed as a shallow argument against welfare. Oh, you shouldn't take welfare because it will remove the burden of providing for yourself. You should struggle for yourself. If you take welfare, you might commit suicide. Something like that. However, that's not what I mean at all. I think if you need welfare, of course you should take it. Suicide is still a relatively rare phenomenon and it's a low risk. Instead, the idea I'm trying to express is that if you find yourself in depression and considering suicide, that one thing you may want to consider is trying to set yourself a task, give yourself a burden to carry, give yourself a purpose to strive towards. And you may be able to find meaning and fulfillment in that effort. And that's more of the idea I'm trying to get across, not that you should reject welfare or look down on people who use welfare, or even that you should reject counseling. I'm sure counseling does have some treatment effect in preventing suicide, but my concern is that a lack of counseling is not what's driving the suicide epidemic, rather that the lack of a burden may be. And burden may be something of a complicated word here. For example, people who lose their jobs are more likely to commit suicide, and surely being unemployed is a burden, but that's not the kind of burden I'm talking about. I'm talking about burden in the way that Jordan Peterson used the word. A burden is something, a task that you set yourself to accomplish, something you work against. So losing your job would in a way be losing your burden, or it might be losing your purpose for getting up out of bed, for going to work, for striving. And that purpose is something you need to seek and find, according to this analysis. As a final note, if you are considering suicide, please don't mistake the contents of this video for professional help, which you should seek. Suicide is a dark, depressing problem, and it's getting worse, but hopefully we'll be able to turn it around. The first step to turning it around, though, is understanding what's causing suicide. And to do that, we need to study it. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click the like button. If you'd like to see more content in a similar style, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks for your time.